You didn't bring it home by accident. You were drawn to it, and that should bother you more than anything else, because some objects don't just sit in your house, they change what is allowed to stay there. Not loudly, not in the way you can point to, but slowly, quietly, until the atmosphere shifts and you can't explain why things feel heavier, why your thoughts are different, why your peace disappears in moments where nothing actually happened. And the worst part is, most people never connected to the one thing they brought into their space, thinking it was harmless. A souvenir, a memory, something small, something meaningless. But there is a reason certain items are made the way they are, sold the way they are, and carried the way they are, and it has nothing to do with decoration, because some objects are not neutral. They are not passive. They were designed, shaped, and sometimes even handled in environments where intention matters, and intention doesn't just disappear because you changed locations. It travels with the object, and once it enters your space, it doesn't ask permission to stay, it simply begins to influence what is already there. You might already feel this, even if you've never said it out loud. That strange discomfort in certain rooms, that tension that shows up for no clear reason, the way your mood shifts in your own home without warning. And you blame stress or sleep or anything else that feels easier to explain. But what if it's not random? What if it started after something entered your space, something you didn't question at the time? And here's where this becomes uncomfortable, because the first sign most people ignore is the simplest one. You felt something when you first saw it. Not excitement, not interest, something else. A pull that didn't make sense, and instead of stepping back, you leaned in. You picked it up, you paid for it, you brought it home. And that moment right there, that was the first agreement. Not spoken, not conscious, but real. Because attraction without understanding is one of the easiest ways people open doors they never intended to open. Now listen carefully, because this is where most people shut down and stop paying attention. The object itself doesn't need to be evil in the way you imagine. It doesn't need to look dark. It doesn't need to feel obvious. In fact, the most effective ones never do. They look cultural, traditional, spiritual, meaningful. They carry symbols you don't fully understand, patterns you never questioned, shapes that were created long before you ever saw them. And those symbols, they are not decoration, they are language. And just because you don't understand the language doesn't mean nothing is being said. Now stay with this, because the first type of object you need to be extremely careful with is the one most people proudly display: statues and figures that represent something spiritual. Not necessarily something you believe in, but something that was believed in somewhere else. And here's the part people avoid. Many of these items were originally created for one purpose: not art, not tourism. They were placed in spaces where people directed attention, energy, intention toward them. They were part of rituals, offerings, repetition. And even when mass-produced versions exist today, the design is still rooted in that original function. You're not holding something random. You're holding a copy of something that was once used to receive attention. And attention is not neutral. Now imagine this: a figure that was once placed before candles, before offerings, before words spoken repeatedly over time, now sitting on your shelf. Not because you believe in it, but because you liked how it looked. Do you see the disconnect? You removed the meaning, but the design was never neutral to begin with. And this is where people make their first critical mistake. They assume intention only matters on their side. I don't believe in it, so it means nothing. That sounds logical, but it ignores the fact that intention was already placed into the design long before you ever touched it. You didn't create the meaning, you inherited it. And bringing that into your space without understanding it is like repeating a word in a language you don't speak and assuming it has no meaning just because you don't understand it. Now here's where it becomes personal. Think about the last time you bought something like this. Not a random object. Something with a face, a form, a symbol. Something that represented spirituality in some way. What did you actually know about it? Not what the seller told you, not what the label said. What did you really know about where it came from, how it was used, what it originally represented? Most people can't answer that. And that gap, that lack of understanding, that's exactly where the risk lives. Because uncertainty doesn't make something harmless. It just makes it easier to ignore. And right now, there's a good chance you already know exactly which object this is pointing to. You've seen it, you've touched it. Maybe it's already in your home. And if that thought just crossed your mind, don't ignore it. Because the moment you recognize something, that's the moment you're responsible for what you do next. And what comes after this is even more uncomfortable, because the second type of object doesn't look spiritual at all, but it's often far more dangerous. And this is where most people relax too early, because the second object doesn't look spiritual, doesn't look symbolic, doesn't look like anything you would question, which is exactly why it slips in unnoticed and stays longer than anything else. Jewelry. Something small. It's something that stays on your body, not just in your house. And that changes everything, because now it's not just in your space, it's attached to you. Now think about this honestly, without filtering it to make it comfortable. How many times have you worn something without knowing where it came from beyond the surface story? A ring, a bracelet, a necklace you bought while traveling, or something that was handed to you, gifted to you, passed down to you, and you never asked deeper questions because it felt unnecessary. It looked harmless, maybe even meaningful. But objects that stay in contact with your body are not passive in the same way as something sitting on a shelf. They move with you. They stay with you. They become part of your routine. And routine is where influence becomes invisible. Now here's the part people avoid because it forces them to rethink things they don't want to question. Not all jewelry is just decoration. In many cultures, certain pieces are created for specific purposes. Protection, luck, connection, influence, words spoken over them, intentions assigned to them. Not always openly, not always obviously, but deliberately. And once that intention is placed, it doesn't disappear just because the object changes owners. It remains attached to the object itself. And when that object is worn, it stays in constant contact with you, not once, not occasionally, constantly. Now imagine wearing something every single day that carries a meaning you never investigated. Something that was created with a purpose you don't fully understand. And instead of questioning it, you made it part of your identity. You don't think about it anymore. You just wear it. That's where it becomes dangerous, because the longer something stays in your routine, the less you question it. And the less you question it, the more influence it has without resistance. Now let's go deeper, because this is where people usually stop thinking and move on. Objects don't need to be charged in a dramatic way to carry intention. Repetition is enough. If something was used repeatedly in a specific way, in a specific context, over time, it builds association, and association is powerful. Think about how quickly a smell can bring back a memory, or how a song can instantly change your mood. That's not random. That's connection built over time. Now apply that to something that was used in rituals, in repeated actions, in environments where people were intentionally directing focus toward it. That pattern doesn't disappear. And when you wear that object, you are stepping into that pattern without even realizing it. Not because you chose it, but because you never questioned it. Now here's the uncomfortable part you're probably already sensing. Some of the most common items people wear today have symbols they don't even recognize. Shapes, signs, patterns that look aesthetic, minimal, cool. But originally, they were not created for style. They were created with meaning. And meaning doesn't fade just because it becomes popular. It just becomes harder, it just becomes harder to notice. Now pause for a second and think about something specific. Something you wear often, not something you barely use, something that's part of your daily routine. Do you actually know what it represents, or do you just know how it looks? Because those are not the same thing. And this is where the second agreement happens. Not when you bought it, but when you kept wearing it without ever asking what it actually means. That repetition, that's what locks it in. And the longer it stays, the more natural it feels, until the idea of removing it feels strange, unnecessary, even uncomfortable. And that's how attachment forms, quietly, without you noticing. Now here's where most people push back. It's just jewelry. That's the phrase that shuts everything down before it even starts. But ask yourself something honestly. If it's just jewelry, then why do people assign meaning to it in the first place? Why do certain pieces represent protection, identity, belief? Why do people pass them down as something more than material? Because even if you personally don't assign meaning, someone else already did, and you're wearing the result of that without knowing what was placed into it. Now don't rush past this, because this is where awareness actually begins. You don't need to panic, you don't need to throw everything away, but you do need to stop pretending that everything you wear is neutral just because it feels normal. Normal is just repetition, and repetition is not proof of safety. Now think about how many times you reached for the same item without thinking, put it on, walked out, lived your day, and never once questioned it. That's not awareness, that's habit. And habit is where influence hides best, because it doesn't need your attention anymore. It already has your routine. Now here's the moment that matters. The next time you pick up something you usually wear, pause, just for a second. Look at it, not as something familiar, but as something unknown. Ask one simple question. What does this actually represent? Not what you think, not what you assume. What does it really mean? And if you don't know, that's the answer you've been avoiding. Because wearing something without understanding it is not neutral. It's a choice to accept something you haven't examined. And once you see that clearly, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't matter. And what comes next is even more subtle, because the third object doesn't stay on your body, and it doesn't sit in one place either. It moves through your entire space without you ever noticing it. And this is where it becomes almost impossible to detect, because the third object doesn't look like an object at all. It looks like something you picked up without thinking, something that felt light, harmless, even positive, and that's exactly why it stays longer than anything else. Written words, printed phrases, decorative texts, something you brought into your home because it felt good, because it sounded uplifting, because it looked meaningful on the surface. But here's the part most people never question. Not every message that sounds peaceful is actually neutral, and not every phrase that feels positive leads you in the right direction. Some words are designed to bypass your guard completely. They don't challenge you, they don't warn you, they don't confront you. They slip in quietly, repeating ideas that slowly reshape what you believe without ever forcing you to examine it. And the moment something repeats often enough, it stops sounding like a suggestion and starts feeling like truth. Now think about how many things you've seen written on objects, on walls, on small decorations, on items you bought while traveling or received as gifts. Short phrases, quotes, symbols combined with words, and you accepted them instantly because they sounded good. Peace, energy, balance, universe, words that feel soft, harmless, even comforting. But comfort is not always truth. And words that feel good are the easiest ones to accept without resistance. Now here's where this becomes dangerous, in a way people don't expect. Words shape direction. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, through repetition. If something is placed in your space where you see it regularly, even if you don't consciously read it every time, it still registers. It still reinforces the same idea over and over again. And over time, that idea becomes part of how you think, how you interpret things, how you respond without realizing why. That's how influence works when it's subtle. It doesn't force you, it conditions you. Now imagine a phrase that sounds peaceful but carries a meaning that shifts responsibility away from truth, away from accountability, away from awareness. A phrase that tells you everything is fine when something is actually wrong. A phrase that encourages you to accept instead of question. to relax instead of discern. And because it feels good, you let it stay. You place it somewhere visible, you read it without thinking, and slowly it becomes part of your internal language. Not because you chose it carefully, but because you didn't question it at all. Now pause and think about this carefully. What messages are repeated in your space right now? Not once, repeated. What phrases have you seen so many times that they no longer stand out? That's where the real influence is. Not in what surprises you, but in what becomes invisible, because it's always there. And this is where the third agreement happens. Not when you first saw the words, but when you stopped noticing them. Because once something blends into the background, it stops being examined. And once it's no longer examined, it starts shaping things without resistance. Now here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Not all messages that feel spiritual are aligned with truth. Some are vague on purpose. They sound deep, but they don't lead anywhere clear. They avoid direction. They avoid responsibility. They replace clarity with feeling. And feeling without truth can take you anywhere. Now ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever accepted a message just because it felt right, without checking what it actually meant? Not once. Repeatedly. That's how these things take hold. Not through force, but through familiarity. And the more familiar something feels, the less you question it, until questioning it feels unnecessary. And that's exactly where the risk is. Because you're no longer choosing what influences you, you're just allowing it. Now don't misunderstand this, because most people either ignore this completely or overreact in the wrong direction. This is not about fear, it's about awareness. It's about recognizing that not everything you bring into your space is neutral just because it looks harmless. It's about understanding that repetition shapes direction, and direction determines where you end up over time. Now here's where this comes together, because these three things, the object you display, the item you wear, and the message you repeat, they don't work separately. They reinforce each other. What you see, what you carry, what you hear over and over again, they create a pattern. And patterns are what shape your decisions without you noticing it. That's why people feel stuck without understanding why. That's why things feel off without a clear reason. Because the environment is influencing them in ways they never examined. Now think about your own space for a second. Not quickly, slowly. What's in it that you never questioned? What's around you that you accepted without understanding? What have you normalized just because it became familiar? Because the moment you start asking those questions honestly, things begin to stand out that you didn't notice before. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. And that's where responsibility begins. Not in fear, not in assumption. And what you do next with that awareness, that's what determines whether anything actually changes. And now you've reached the point where you can't pretend this is just information anymore. Because once you've seen the pattern, the only thing left is the decision you're about to make. And that decision will tell you more about your direction than anything you've said or believed up to this point. Because awareness without action doesn't protect you, it only removes your excuse. And most people stop right here, not because they don't understand, but because acting on what they understand feels inconvenient, uncomfortable, even unnecessary. That's the real barrier. Not knowledge, not lack of clarity, resistance. And resistance always sounds reasonable when you're trying to keep things the same. It's not that serious. It's just decoration. It's just something small. But small things repeated over time are what shape everything. Not big dramatic moments, not one-time decisions, patterns. And if those patterns are built around things you never questioned, then you're not directing your environment. Your environment is directing you. Now here's where this becomes uncomfortable in a way most people try to avoid. Because once you recognize that something in your space might not be neutral, the next step is simple, but it forces a real choice. Remove it or justify keeping it. And justification is where people stay stuck the longest, because it lets you keep everything exactly as it is while convincing yourself nothing needs to change. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You tell yourself it's harmless because you've had it for so long. But time doesn't make something safe. Familiarity doesn't make something neutral. It just makes it harder to question. Now stop and think about the object that came to your mind earlier. Not all of them. The one that stood out. The one you recognize without wanting to focus on it. That's the one that matters. Because recognition doesn't happen randomly. It happens when something aligns with what you've just understood. And ignoring that moment doesn't make it disappear. It just delays what you already know you should do. Now here's the part that most people try to skip because it removes every comfortable option. You don't need more information. You don't need to research for hours. You don't need to wait until you feel completely certain. You already have enough clarity to act. And the longer you delay, the more that clarity fades into the background, replaced by routine again. That's how people lose moments that could have changed something real. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't know when they did. Now imagine this clearly, because this is where everything becomes real. You walk into your space, you look at that object, and instead of ignoring it, you pick it up. Not casually, intentionally. You look at it as something you no longer assume is neutral. You see it for what it might represent, not just what it looks like. And in that moment, you make a decision, not based on fear, based on awareness. You remove it from your space. You don't place it somewhere else. You don't hide it. You remove it completely. And that moment, that simple, quiet action, breaks a pattern that may have been running without your awareness for a long time. Now here's what most people don't expect. Nothing dramatic happens. No instant change. No visible shift. And that's exactly why people doubt it mattered. But change that actually lasts doesn't always feel dramatic at the moment it happens. It feels small, almost insignificant. And that's how real shifts begin, quietly, through decisions that don't feel impressive but change direction over time. Now here's where the pressure comes back, because this is the moment most people will fail. Even after everything they've just understood, they will delay. They will say, "I'll do it later," and later will look exactly like now. Nothing will change. The object will stay. The pattern will continue, and awareness will slowly fade until it feels like this moment never mattered. That's how easily people lose control over something they actually saw clearly for a second. Now, don't let this become one of those moments, because right now, you're at a point where the next action you take will either confirm everything you just understood or prove that it didn't change anything at all. And what happens next is entirely up to you. And this is where everything closes, because there are only two kinds of moments like this: the ones that pass and change nothing, and the ones where you actually do something different. And the difference between them is never knowledge, it's always the decision you make when no one is watching. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. Now. Because if you walk away from this and go back into your space exactly the same way, without stopping, without looking again, without touching the one thing that stood out, then nothing you just heard mattered in practice. It may have felt important, it may have sounded real, but it didn't change your direction. And direction is what determines everything that follows. Now don't soften this, because this is where most people lie to themselves. You already know what needs to go. Not everything, not your entire home. One thing. The one that made you pause for even a second. The one you tried not to focus on. The one you immediately started justifying in your head. That's the one. And if you leave it where it is after recognizing it, then you didn't miss the message. You chose to ignore it. That's the difference. Now here's the part that makes this real, because once you act, even in a small way, something changes that you can't go back from. You prove to yourself that you're not just reacting to what you hear, you're willing to move when something becomes clear. And that kind of decision builds something most people never develop: control over their own environment. Not in theory. Because environment is not just what surrounds you, it's what you allow to stay. And what you allow to stay shapes what you get used to. And what you get used to shapes what you stop questioning. And what you stop questioning eventually shapes who you become without you noticing it. That's how small things become permanent patterns. Now, stop for a second and picture this clearly. You remove that object, it's gone. Not moved, not hidden, gone. And for a moment, nothing happens. But later, something feels slightly different. Not dramatic, just lighter, more still, more clear, and you won't even be able to explain exactly why. That's how subtle changes begin, not with noise, with absence. The absence of something that didn't belong there in the first place. Now here's the final thing most people won't accept, because it removes every remaining excuse if something in your space has even a small chance of influencing you in a way you don't understand. Keeping it is not neutral. It's a decision, and removing it is also a decision. You don't get to avoid choosing. You're choosing either way. The only question is which direction that choice takes you. Now, don't overcomplicate this, because that's how people avoid acting. You don't need to understand everything about it. You don't need to prove anything. You need to respond to what you already recognized. That's it. One clear action. One real decision. And if you do that, even once, you break a pattern that most people stay in their entire lives without ever noticing it. And if you don't, then everything continues exactly the same, just with the illusion that you're aware of it. And that illusion is what keeps people stuck the longest. So don't leave this as another moment that felt important but changed nothing. Make it real, because the difference between knowing and changing is always one decision, and that decision is sitting right in front of you.